Name's Jake Davis, and I'm presenting to you basically I want to identify a problem in rural education and try to create a plan to alleviate that problem. So this is a presentation on poverty in rural education. Specifically, we're targeting community resources in rural areas, or as I will present, a lack of community resources in rural areas. First of all, here is the overview. Basically, what is going on in our media in our country today is that the educational focus has been on urban areas rather than rural areas. And it kind of seems like rural areas are being forgotten when it comes to poverty issues that are definitely affecting a major portion of our population. So the overview here details most of that, and it details the purpose of this presentation. But I'm going to save you guys from reading all this information and just get to it myself. The first thing we're going to do is identify some of these challenges faced by rural communities. Specifically, all of this will relate to, again, the lack of community resources in these rural communities. The first of these is demographics. The problem is listed right there, and that is that college-educated rural inhabitants are leaving their communities to live in urban and suburban areas. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, rural residents are less educated than urban residents, with only 20% possessing a bachelor's degree or more compared to 29% of urban residents. So essentially what's happening is the people with skills and the ability to foster a community and to address complicated issues that communities face along the way are leaving rural communities, and they're leaving people behind that don't have the abilities or capabilities to address these issues. The cause, this migration has been a trend in America throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, but some of the reasons for this immigration out of rural areas into urban areas are things such as cultural amenities and lack of job opportunities. Second challenge that urban areas face are the lack of job opportunities in their communities. The job opportunities that do exist are menial jobs with low wages, which causes people to work who do work in these areas to work half the time as their urban counterparts. The cause of this is possibly a deteriorating labor market in rural areas, but also may be associated with the lack of labor supply, as rural areas are not attractive locations for businesses who need highly educated individuals. So this actually does relate to the previous slide that we just presented. Essentially, businesses don't want to go to rural areas because the people who have the skills to bring success to their business no longer live in those areas. Challenge, refusal of aid. So some of these two previous slides we mentioned contribute to poverty in these areas. And one of the things the federal government has done is create programs to help people in all areas, not just rural areas, who are impoverished. The problem with this in rural areas is many of the families who live in these places don't accept the aid that is offered to them because of the stigma associated with its acceptance. Research has indicated that this has caused or contributed to increases in deaths of despair, meaning suicide or drug-related overdose. How does this contribute to that? Well, essentially, these people who live in the rural areas feel there's no way out of the pit of poverty. There's no way to climb the social ladder. And it's left them with a sense of helplessness. And we listed several issues there that cause a sense of helplessness in rural communities. Specifically, the one that I think is very important is this one, which is just the overall psychological effect of living in impoverished communities. I grew up in a rural area myself, pretty poor. My family wasn't poor, but there was always this sense, this black cloud kind of hanging over our community growing up, that we weren't as good as other people that lived in more urban places, that our choices were limited as far as opportunities as we became adults. And I do think this is very important to combat as an educator, and it's something that I've tried to do as a teacher throughout my career. Next challenge that rural areas face is immigration. While immigration provides rural areas with much needed laborers, it is oftentimes difficult for the native inhabitants of these communities to adjust to new cultures. Also, rural schools often lack the resources necessary to adjust to the needs of students who are not native English speakers, leading to poor literacy scores on standardized tests. In addition, many immigrants are impoverished, increasing already inflated poverty levels in rural communities. I would like to note that immigrants oftentimes have higher work rates and marriage rates than native-born Americans who experience poverty, excluding them from two major symptoms of poverty: deterioration of family life and a lack of work opportunities. So in a way, the influx of immigration is a stabilizing force for rural areas, but it causes some major issues. Just the cultural complexities involved with a whole new culture moving into a very small town that's usually more tight knit than what you would think in an urban or suburban area, along compounded with the challenges that schools face and the lack of resources these communities already have to combat these new challenges, just kind of creates a major issue here with immigration. Effects on rural education due to the lack of inhabitants. So basically, we've identified the causes here of the lack of community resources. Basically, what's going on. Now, I want to talk about how these causes affect specifically education. Due to the lack of inhabitants with higher educations, rural communities lack the human resources necessary to foster communal ties, thus leaving students without the resources necessary to reduce the symptoms of poverty on local school districts. Next, the refusal of government aid leaves families prioritizing needs such as clothing and food before their students' education. Students who don't feel safe or are hungry are naturally going to have difficulty focusing in school. Economic realities leave rural school districts with less money, thus resources, than their urban and suburban counterparts. Deterioration of family life and feelings of despair contribute to a cultural environment that does not promote student success. With immigration of new peoples into rural areas, cultural interactions between students become more complex. And the last one here, influxes in immigration affect literacy objectives and performance benchmarks that are used to judge the efficacy of rural school districts. All of these causes that we've mentioned affect rural education in this way. And we have here a picture of rural inhabitants holding signs out on the road trying to save their school, which is an issue that many rural places are facing as they're kind of being left behind by people migrating out, and just a general trend towards urban and a favor of our media and our entire nation to suburban and urban areas. Now, there are many programs designed to help with what we've described, to alleviate the symptoms of poverty. Over 80 programs exist to help low-income families and individuals. We have two pictured here, icons, logos, Medicaid and EITC, that we're going to talk about. The first one of these is public health insurance, Medicaid. Medicaid is the country's primary public health insurance program for low-income populations, along with CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, which covers children not covered by Medicaid. Particularly helpful to rural areas, Medicaid allows for employees in rural areas to have Medicaid. Basically, it benefits rural people disproportionately than it does urban people, because urban people are most likely going to have jobs where their employers offer health coverage. That's not the case as much in rural areas. It's proven very effective, Medicaid, and its abilities were expanded under the ACA, or Affordable Health Care Act, the federal government's largest need-tested program offered to low-income families. So Medicaid costs our government millions of dollars, but it does offer and alleviate many of the pains and problems associated with poverty and the modern issues that we just face as a society. Another one of these programs that aids impoverished families is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. SNAP provides nutritional support for low-wage working families. Research suggests SNAP succeeds in reducing poverty, improves food security among impoverished households, and positively affects children's health, thus improving their success in the classroom. Families who qualify for SNAP also qualify for the National School Lunch Program. that provides free or reduced price lunches for students. So SNAP, Medicaid, basically dealing with health. Medicaid helps people who can't afford health insurance, and SNAP offers nutrition for families along with the free and reduced lunch program in schools. EITC helps the monetary issues of impoverished populations. In particular, it allows for low to moderate income workers and families to get a tax break or credits that reduce the amount of taxes you owe and may increase your refund. Almost 25% of all EITC claims go to tax filers in rural areas. So it definitely is something that affects rural communities. So those are the resources available for rural inhabitants to ease and aid the ailments and symptoms of an impoverished lifestyle. Now, what does this mean for schools and educators? Well, it means quite a bit, actually, and we've listed it on this one slide here, so we'll go through that as quickly as possible. First of all, schools are the only institutions that come into contact with almost all poor children, meaning that we have a responsibility to try to reduce poverty and fix the situation. We have a human responsibility as well as a professional responsibility to our communities. Evidence shows that schools, when given the right tools, can reduce the effects of poverty and improve student success. So there's evidence that shows that this is not a hopeless case, that there are ways to have a positive impact on these situations. Schools must understand the macro forces causing the cultural environments in which they operate in order to develop informed policies to alleviate the effects of rural poverty. Essentially, what this means is we need to inform our colleagues, teacher leaders, policy leaders, and let them know what's exactly the problems with poverty are, what we've detailed in this slideshow, and basically create a plan and policies and enact them so that we can see change actually take place in these communities. Schools must work with the community in order to work to address issues affecting them. We must intervene as early as possible in the lives of impoverished children, as research suggests that children who experience poverty at a young age are affected long-term by their experiences and less likely to have success in school. Schools must endorse federal programs to the largest extent possible and encourage families who truly need assistance to use the resources available to them. Schools must help local social service agencies connect with families in need. Schools must be an institution that works to end poverty in the community by partnering with workforce developing agencies and focusing on preparing students for jobs in the local workforce. Now, these implications that we've recognized, the causes of the lack of community resources in rural areas and the effects have all been used and thought of when creating a plan for addressing these issues. So that's what we're going to present here. We've got 3 initiatives. The first of those is how we're going to support a positive learning environment that combats the problems created by an impoverished population. First of all, teachers and staff members will do everything possible to limit the distractions of poverty. Provide technology when possible. Provide food when possible. Comfort, shelter, clothes when possible. Local history will be taught within social studies content to foster communal pride. This is something we mentioned a minute ago. There has to be a change of mind, a belief in students that their community is not lesser than. In fact, it has its own character and its own life and history that make it beautiful and important. Not big, but beautiful and important. And that needs to be fostered so that students can have a sense of pride in their local community and their home. Spirit or morale days will be instituted throughout the year. Just days that, we want to basically create a positive environment for students, a sanctuary for them. And this goes through K through 12, all the way into high school levels as well. I think that kind of gets lost a little bit as we get a little bit older. As far as education goes for older students. Students will report daily mental health that will be collected by school counselors. This is voluntary. Of course, students don't have to participate in this, but it will be fostered and encouraged by our staff. The school that I currently work at actually has one of these programs. It's called Rhythm, and students come in and they report their emotional health, well-being, their mental health, and we just have this data that kind of measures the healthiness, the mental health of our school system. Initiative 2, bolster career and labor preparation curriculum. So we recognize some issues in rural communities: lack of labor force, a lack of educated people. So to combat that, we want to expand the amount of career and workforce prep courses that exist within our systems, revisit the curriculum of these courses to make sure it mirrors the needs of the community, and if possible, partner with agencies or local businesses that are willing to cultivate workers and train them while they're in high school, so that you see that labor force just basically go straight from the high school into the workforce, which used to be a major part of our American education. Initiative 3, get aid to those who need it. School counselors need to create relationships with local contacts or representatives of federal programs and social services. An open line of communication between schools and people who can get families to the aid and the help that they need. Teachers must communicate concerns, observations, and possible solutions to issues in the school relating to poverty, and they need to communicate this to their counselors and administration, so we can just create an atmosphere and an environment that is really trying to make an effort to combat the poverty and the lack of resources found in these rural communities. All school personnel must do their part in getting families help who are truly affected by poverty. And then finally, we want to close by our position on rural community resources. I'm going to read it verbatim here. It says, many of the problems associated with rural poverty and the lack of resources in rural communities are macro level issues out of the hands of educators and principals. Though this is the case, schools are vital institutions in rural communities. Front and center, schools have the opportunity and responsibility to alleviate the symptoms of poverty faced by their community's children. Along with the plan detailed in the previous slide, it is my opinion that rural schools should take a radical approach to confronting poverty in their communities. School and community leaders should recognize the central role that schools play in building communities and become agents of change rather than elements of poverty themselves. In order for this to take place, schools will have to take active roles in fighting poverty and go beyond the basic requirements generally expected of teachers and principals. This requires a vigilant approach and a deep knowledge of both the challenges the community faces and the culture of the community these schools serve. If this approach is adopted and a plan implemented, I truly believe rural communities can overcome the challenges they face, in particular the challenge that we presented here, which is the lack of community resources. And here we have references that I used to gather this information and prepare this presentation. Okay, thank you for listening to me. Again, this is Jake Davis and my presentation on the lack of community resources and the available community resources in rural areas. Thank you.